Hey folks, good afternoon. We're going to talk about the Exploit Prediction Scoring System, EPSS, the user guide. Show of hands, how many people know what EPSS is or have heard of it? Oh wow. I would say about 80% of the audience. Jay Jacobs will be happy, the guy who created it. So, my name is Chris Madden from Yahoo Product Security Team, and I've been working with EPSS, on EPSS and using EPSS for approximately 2 years now. So risk is per asset and depends on the impact of a vulnerability being exploited by a threat. So most people would have read that, thought themselves, yeah, makes sense, I get it. So I read it and I thought, well, I don't get it. How do I use all that? So this time last year, I presented a B-Sides, top left, understanding vulnerability data, trying to understand all the building blocks, whether it was EPSS, CISA KEV, all these things, and how can I use them to optimize the flow of software in our DevOps pipelines. So since then, I've gone on to work on a guide in the middle, risk-based prioritization guide, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this talk here, bottom left, EPSS. This morning I spoke about impact. And top right recently gave a presentation at Carnegie Mellon CERT on vulnerability prioritization options. And really all of this comes from risk is per asset and depends on the impact of a vulnerability being exploited by a threat, those few words, going deep on that. So why the content? So recently, a few weeks ago, somebody posted on LinkedIn, they were trying to come up with a taxonomy and somebody working in automotive, and they came across my B-Sides talk last year. Don't know this person, but they found the content useful. And that's pretty much why I do it, to help me and others like me understand this stuff and apply this stuff and benefit from this stuff. So the abstract, Exploit Prediction Scoring System, the user guide. So EPSS, powerful capability to help organizations prioritize vulnerabilities based on their likelihood of exploitation. And it's an important capability, and we'll see why shortly. So it's free, publicly available, and there's growing support for it in vendors' tools. But what I found was most vendors and users don't know how to use it. So they ask for it, they get it, but they don't know what to do with it. And I'm on the advisory board for some vendors, and I asked them, hey, why don't you provide any guidance on, your tool supports it, why don't you provide guidance? And simply put, they don't know how to use it. So that's where I stepped in. So originally as a user, I want to understand, well, how do I use this thing? So I volunteered to work with Jay and the EPSS creators to write the guide from a user's point of view. And the guide was released in March at that URL and socialized via LinkedIn. So in this talk, you learn to understand where EPSS fits in the overall risk picture, how to use it and why, and how others are using it. So the guide launch went something like that. At the bottom are the various folks that contributed across the globe, across industries, some of the thought leaders in this space. And so my value add was to work with those folks, some of whom created various standards, or worked on standards, and organize the contribution of their content in a user-friendly way so that normal users can use it. So, some of the feedback. I particularly like the top left one, very pragmatic. Off to update our process doco. It'll be much shorter, read and do this. I like that. Other feedback from people in telecoms industry. And then one that I'm particularly proud of, Chris Hughes. Anyone know Chris Hughes? Heard of Chris Hughes? He's like the Mr. Beast of vulnerability management. Let me put it like that. All right. So, how did that happen, I hear you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. So let's go back to the beginning. So, in the beginning, I said to Jay, who created EPSS, okay, here's how I think we should go about this. So add me to the Slack channel and the mailing list, and here's how I think we're going to do things. And for folks starting off in their career, I think this is useful guidance. This is something I wish I knew when I started. And it's all about how do you get things done and deliver value. Okay, so starting off with taking a big thing, define the list of things you want to do, the backlog of items, prioritize the backlog based on the value they deliver and the effort it requires to deliver them, and get real customers involved, whether it's vendors or users, get them involved. So basically turn those affected into those involved in delivering the solution. So you get that tight feedback loop. And similarly with the folks writing the standard, work directly with them. So again, that tight feedback loop to guide what you're doing. And then we flesh out the top items and we work through those and deliver on those in short increments and iterate on that and learn as we go. That's standard lean agile stuff. And most people, especially techies, don't do it. And so before anything is done, I'm very much into time management and getting things done. So one way to get things done is to plan a meeting to present the thing that you need to get done. And what's a conference? Only a very large meeting in front of hundreds of people, whether it's in an auditorium or YouTube online. So it's a good way to focus the mind and get things done. So here we are today. So as a hardcore techie, I didn't start off focusing on the technical aspects. I did start off focusing on customer focus and introduced the idea of design thinking, understanding the problem first, and then designing a solution for the guide. Again, something that most techies don't fully get or don't do. And basically getting users, the affected users, to write the user scenarios. So they're involved and they're contributing to the solution. The writing style is very much opinionated. There's a lot of books out there that lack opinions. When I was earlier in my career, my boss told me, look, I don't want to understand this stuff. You're getting paid to tell me what to do. Give me 3 options. Tell me which is the best one and why. And that's your job. All right, give me the opinions and the data behind it. So that was the style. It's very short, succinct, and I refer to various books if you want to read the history in the background. And it's very much user-centric view. Because it's not sponsored by anyone, I can pretty much say what I want. And I did. I do have opinions. I've been around a while, as you can tell from my hair. And so I expressed those opinions, trying to make this useful for users who don't have time to read the books or get the understanding of just tell me what I need to do and how do I use this thing. So after reading the guide, you should understand risk, i.e. that formula we spoke about earlier. There's a lot to it, but it's relatively easy to understand. Understand how to prioritize CVEs by risk, and that's a big deal because there's 100 CVEs published per day. There's now approximately 230k published CVEs, vulnerabilities of open source and third-party software. So there's a lot to prioritize. And doing so gives you a significant reduction in your security effort and improvement in your security posture by fixing or remediating the things that need to be fixed first by risk. So with the guide, I like to understand and play, so I also provided source code. So not only did I provide succinct opinions, the rationale behind them, but the source code so that people can reproduce the data in their environment. Okay, so the intended audience was product engineers, security managers, cyber defenders, and tool providers, which is a subset of the personas that we defined, or that we got users to define for the guide. So, the vulnerability landscape. So, as you probably know, if you work in this space, it's not a magical, mysterious wonderland as portrayed in the picture. The reality is somewhat different. An overview of the standards, we have CVEs, as in identifiers associated with vulnerabilities in open source and third-party software. They're enriched. More recently, the National Vulnerability Database stalled, and now other CNAs are picking up the enrichment, and they're using CVSS to score the data. And so all that data feeds into EPSS, the CVSS data and other data, and we'll look at the other data sources to determine what is the probability of exploitation of a published CVE within the next 30 days. That's what EPSS ultimately gives you. And then there's CISA KEV, which is a list of known exploited vulnerabilities. Okay, so vulnerability reality then is somewhat different. Why should I care about all this? Well, Given the explosion in the number of published CVEs, increasing year on year, many organizations are drowning in a sea of vulnerabilities, not knowing what to remediate first. Many organizations, industries, whether it's PCI FedRAMP, use the CVSS base course. Even though the CVSS guide says don't use this to prioritize only, that's what many tool vendors and companies do. So the solution is prioritizing vulnerabilities by exploitation, as recommended by CISA and Gartner. Whether it's vulnerabilities being exploited in the wild, a la CISA KEV, or those that are likely to be exploited, a la EPSS. And doing so significantly reduces cost and risk. Looking at a DevOps pipeline, as an example, this is from the Cloud Security Alliance generic diagram. We see that there are multiple tools across the pipeline that detect CVEs at different stages. And about typically 80% of the software in products is open source. So that's a lot of CVEs. So exploitation. So the point of all this is that if we prioritize by exploitation, we reduce our cost and risk. So the expanded quote by CISA, they give figures of less than 4% of the total number of CVEs have been publicly exploited. Now CISA is a security agency, okay, and they're taking a pragmatic approach, saying rather than saying fix everything, which nobody can, they say fix the ones that are exploited. And that's like 4 or 5% is the numbers. Similarly, Gartner, who isn't a security agent, he's an industry analyst, takes the same view. Focus on the things that are being exploited in the wild. Again, to improve your security posture and reduce your effort. So how many of these vulnerabilities are actually being exploited? Well, depending on which report you read, only about 5% or fewer. So that's in contrast to CVSS base scores. So 15% of CVs are ranked critical, as in scored 9+, 65% critical or high, 7+, and 96% are critical, high, or medium, as in 4+. When you think, okay, if we have to fix mediums and above, you think, okay, well, that's probably whatever, I don't know, 10, 20, but it turns out it's 96% of them, pretty much all of them. And so with exploitation data, there's an asymmetry in the data. In other words, the highest risk things, there's less of them, and we can exploit that asymmetry. Our ability to remediate depends on the priority of the risk of the CVEs, the ones we want to remediate based on our security posture, but also on our capacity. So by focusing on the highest risk things with the smaller populations, that's how we can achieve that reduction in risk and cost. So how to prioritize? Well, a large part of my B-Sides presentation last year was coming up with this taxonomy and trying to understand, well, what are the data sources for risk in general and specifically threat in this case? And so if we look at things like starting at the known evidence, and if we look from the top down, this would be the populations are smaller and the risk is higher. So in other words, if something was exploited in your bug bounty incident response before, that's likely to show up again in the future in your organization. And then there's CISA KEV, there's approximately 1.1k vulnerabilities listed in CISA KEV. And then you have weaponized vulnerabilities, as in somebody has created a template that can be scripted in Metasploit or nuclei. Those are much higher likelihood of exploitation. And then there's proof of concepts. And on average, about half of the published CVEs have proof of concept. So the population size increases significantly as the risk decreases. We can see where CVSS fits in terms of the generic, thing is called severity, but it really breaks down to two things. There's the impact metrics, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and then there's the exploitability or automatability, as in how easy is it to automate a vulnerability exploit. So exploitation, well, it would be great if we could just grab the list of known exploited vulnerabilities, all of them, and fix those. The problem is it doesn't exist. CISA KEV represents about 1.1k of published CVEs, We saw from the figures that about 5K of published CVEs, of which there's 230K, are actually exploited, so there's a gap. So let's say figures approximately 10K, depending on how you measure known exploited. So there's a gap. There isn't a list anywhere that says fix these ones. So this is where EPSS plays in. We can look at CISA KEV and say, hey, these are the ones that are listed on CISA KEV that are known exploited, but then there's the other ones that aren't. And we can use EPSS there, and we'll see how we can use that. So EPSS. Well, what is it? So it's a data-driven effort for estimating the likelihood or probability that a software vulnerability will be exploited in the wild in the next 30 days. Okay? So think about that for a moment. Somebody's giving you a score, probability between 0 and 1, for all public CVEs, saying, here's the probability it's going to be exploited in the wild in the next 30 days. So there's a lot of folks involved in this, myself included. Some folks I've talked to here are in the special interest group. It's a fantastic forum. But it's from the same folks first who also manage and publish the CVSS standard. It's free. And it's a measure of the threat aspect of risk. And this is a fairly recent capability. As in recent years, we didn't have things like EPSS or CISA KEV telling us which ones are being exploited in the wild or likely to be exploited in the wild. So what does it provide? Well, ultimately, it provides a score of probability, and you can also get a percentile, and which percentile is that score, which is kind of like a second-order version of that score. And then there's coverage and efficiency and effort figure, which we'll go into. In other words, you're probably thinking, well, if I look at the score, where do I draw the line? And so we'll look at that. There's an API, and you can pull all the data, or individual data, or time series of data. So the model itself, there's different versions. The latest version was launched March last year. There's another version, updated version, due round about now. And it's improving all the time. You can see many, many data sources. Everything from gray noise to CISA KEV, various, zero-day projects. So many, many data sources, including social media. And the idea is that as there's more activity on, these feeds, the likelihood of exploitation increases. And the partners have a lot of data, as in the intrusion detection systems that are used as an input signal are deployed across many, many thousands of organizations worldwide. And so it's based on the scans for CVEs showing up in those IDSs and honeypots. So it's based on what's actually happening in reality across enterprises. And that data is used for the model to predict and train on, did the model match those data, those exploitations or scans that were detected from the IDSs? And so you can, as with any model, test it forward in time to see is it actually working. And it does. And it's improving all the time. So various vendors are using it. There's hundreds. I've listed some of them you'll know quite well. So many tools and vendors are using EPSS, from AWS, etc. So EPSS applied. Okay, so how do we apply this to our environment? Well, the very first thing I did when I looked at EPSS is I like to validate things, not, take things in blind trust. So if you're going to validate something that predicts exploitation, I thought, well, where's the data source for exploitation? So I looked at CISA KEV. So CISA KEV is a list of known exploited vulnerabilities by CISA, US government agency. So these things are known exploited. And I plotted EPSS versus those CVEs, looking at, say, CVSS base score and EPSS, and then color-coded them. So if a CVE had a Metasploit or nuclei template, in other words, it was weaponized, then it shows up as purple, etc. So trying to provide the color coding of the data sources per our risk taxonomy. So what we see is for CISA KEV is about 50-50. So what does that tell us? Does that mean it's not working or it is working? Well, it is working. but not all the vulnerabilities in CISA KEV are prioritized by EPSS, and we'll look at why that is. But recalling that CISA KEV is only a subset of the known exploited vulnerabilities. So ultimately, we're going to use these two things together, CISA KEV and EPSS. So even if you look at the subset of CISA KEV, so CISA KEV represents the 1.1K, the most important CVEs of the 230K published CVEs. And within those, there's cybersecurity advisories published by CISA and other international government agencies saying, of that 1.1K subset, here's the most important subset of that. And if we plot that against EPSS, we'll see that EPSS is high for the vast majority of them, but not all of them. Again, there's good reasons for that. So how do we use these things together? Known or active exploitation with EPSS. And this is it. So putting together the emoji worry quadrant. So pretty much, if something is known actively exploited, whether it shows up in your organization through your bug bounty or is listed on CISA KEV or some other source that says this has been actively exploited, then that takes precedence. That's the priority, regardless of what EPSS says. Then there's the other ones that don't show up in a known exploited data source, but EPSS says is high. So they're priority as well. So you use them together. So it's like an OR of the two things. Does it show up in example CISA KEV? And is the EPSS score high? That's how you use it. And, that amounts to approximately 5% of CVEs that are being exploited. That's how you determine, well, from no known list of here's the actively exploited CVEs, which ones you want to fix. That's how you get towards your 5%. Simple as that. Okay? And it's important to call out that it's approximately 5%, depending where you cut the threshold. Unlike CVSS, where, as you said, if it's critical, that's 15%. If it's critical and high, these are big figures. When we focus on exploitation, we effectively exploit the asymmetry in the data, and we're looking at approximately 5% of CVEs. That's the beauty of focusing on exploitation. It's a much, much smaller subset with data sources to back it up. So EPSS for your environment. So EPSS, the model is trained on enterprise environments. So if you're an enterprise, it'll work well. Okay? If you're a car, that's a different setup. So it's important to understand that, if your environment is an enterprise, large or small, EPSS is a good fit. And that's purely because the intrusion detection systems that are deployed, that are used as data validation for the model, they live in enterprises across the globe. So not to say it won't work so well for a car. It will, but there will be some differences based on the difference in environment. And it's also best suited to network attacks, again, based on the technology used to feed or validate the model, these intrusion detection systems and honeypots, which are accessed over the network. So when we were writing the guide, there was a vulnerability that CISA warned about, and it turned out that the attack vector was local as in not network, and that's why it ultimately had a low EPSS score. So on the one hand, you had CISA saying, oh, this is bad, you need to fix this. EPSS score was low. And that's okay. We said we can use the two things together, CISA KEV or high EPSS. Okay? So 0 days. So EPSS relies on CVE data. 0 days, by definition, don't have CVEs assigned to them yet. So EPSS is not going to tell you about the 0 days until you get a CVE assigned. Gartner does say that, we tend to overfocus on 0 days, even though a very small percentage are actually 0 days. So, some of the takeaways from that section, we shouldn't use CVSS or EPSS alone, we should use them together. EPSS can be used with known exploitation as an OR to prioritize. Yeah, we're not going to get EPSS scores for 0 days, and we shouldn't go chasing 0 days. For CVSS, it does support exploitation maturity, as in that is data input, but it's up to you to provide it. Unlike the other CVSS parameters that are provided, you get to provide that. Okay, EPSS thresholds. So with all these things, it's kind of where do we draw the line? Within the EPSS special interest group, when we're writing the user guide, I asked users to write their scenarios and what they wanted. So typically what people ask for is what they're familiar with. So things like CBSS, it has these scores, critical, high, etc. And so they want the same for EPSS. So, and that's, you know, they don't understand EPSS, so they want it to be familiar and similar to what they're familiar with. So CBSS, as I said, already supports exploitation maturity input, which does affect the scores. Okay, that's the temporal aspect of CBSS beyond the base score. And so if you do want that critical, medium, high with CBSS, then you just plug your EPSS data into that, and that's how you get that, rather than trying to assign critical, medium, highs directly to the EPSS score. Second thing people often ask for is, well, just give me one source. And that's especially for tool vendors. They don't want to have to pull data from multiple different sources, whether it's CISA KEV or whatever. They want to say, okay, you have a tool. I want that to be the single source of truth. But the reality is, as we saw, it isn't by definition the single source of truth. It should be used in conjunction with other evidence of exploitation, like CISA KEV, and using the two things together is how to use them. So by definition, it isn't the single source for exploitation. But again, if you want to, you know, roll up or combine these things, you can roll them up into CBSS, the temporal score. So now we're going to talk about thresholds. And to understand thresholds, we need to understand precision and recall. And this gets into, you know, true and false, positives and negatives. And there's no perfect tool. There's no magical tool that finds all the stuff you need to find and only that stuff. You always get you know, it comes down to where do you draw the line. The more stuff you want to find, the more stuff you're going to find that you didn't want to find. That's the simple version of it. Illustrated here from Wikipedia. It's a good view of precision versus recall. So we can use this as a way to determine thresholds. Now, this is complicated, but it's not once we understand it. So let's start with a perfect tool. Its precision and recall would be 1. So we'd be up in the top right. So there's no false positives and negatives, ultimately. So we're up in the top right. That's a perfect tool. It doesn't exist in reality, but that's, if it did, that's where we'd have a nice, you know, square lines in our diagram. So the idea is we want to get as close to that as possible. And you can see over the model versions, green, version 1, version 2, we're now at version 3. It is getting a lot closer. So it's getting closer to that perfect skill. Bottom left is, if we say that about 5% of CVs are actually exploited, that means that just by guessing, we're going to get whatever 5% of them right, if we were to guess. So that's kind of just no skill. And that's, you'll see that's pretty close to where CBSS is in terms of, CBS is not a predictor of exploitation, and it's not designed to be. And you'll see that's why the CBSS score shows up down there. So don't use CBSS scores as a predictor of exploitability. And so then the idea is that looking at the model and looking at how many things showed up in the intrusion detection system as, you know, these vulnerabilities were attempted to be exploited based on the signatures detected, we can cut the line at various thresholds for EPSS. And when we, you know, plot the graph, this is what we end up with. So that's sort of good in terms of the model. You know, we can use standard things like the F1 score, and it's kind of like an optimal version of true and false, positives and negatives. That's cool. But as I said earlier, ultimately we care about our effort. So if we look at it from an effort point of view, now this was the original diagram. Not many people get log diagrams, and so this is kind of a bit overwhelming initially. What this shows is coverage, which is, you know, the percent of vulnerabilities with observed exploitation activity that we had prioritized based on our threshold, and then the effort is, well, how many did we need to fix? And so it's all about where do we draw the line. This is, for most people, they don't think in log scale, so it's harder to understand. We do care about our efforts. So let's take the same data and just use a linear scale. And so with emojis to support it. So when we draw it from a linear point of view, when we look at the EPSS probability for all published CVEs, what we see is that there's very few CVEs that have a high EPSS probability. Most of them, the vast majority, have a low probability. That's why the graph, is like that hockey stick. Okay? And so what we want to, if we start off with step 1, we can look at the effort line at the bottom, and we see that there's a relatively small change in our percentage effort for the EPSS probability range from like 100% on the right all the way back to 10%. Okay, very little efforts in. We don't need to fix much more to address that between 10 to 100% of CVEs by EPSS probability. So that's interesting. Second point then is, well, there's a large change in percentage effort, as we move down below that, approximately 10%. So we are sensitive to our effort. That's what costs resources. But we end up fixing a whole lot more of CVEs, and they have a lower probability of exploitation. So we kind of want to stay away from that area because we end up fixing a whole lot of stuff that is less important. And so the efficiency drops off significantly from below 10%. So in simple terms, we can pick an initial threshold. The guidance is simply, given all of that, pick a threshold of approximately 10% for EPSS and adjust it based on your reality. How many CVEs show up in your organization and what your resources are. And the other thing is, for a given organization, the graph, when you plot the EPSS curve, the probabilities for those CVEs, is going to vary. So if you have more CVEs with higher EPSS scores, the graph is going to be shifted upwards or downwards if it's the opposite. So there's no point in picking an exact figure like 0.097. That doesn't make any sense unless you know what you're doing. So that's why 0.1 is a good approximation. So the guide basically says, look, start at 0.1 and adjust based on your CVs, based on your reality. And this is, we worked with EdgeScan. They provided data in terms of detected CVEs, and this is a plot of those. So we tried to use real data to inform the guide. Okay, so if we look at some of the benefits of EPSS, so in addition to allowing us to focus on the things that are being exploited at 5%, the other thing most folks are interested in, early warning. I want to know, in advance if something's going to be exploited. And we can see here from a recent Fortinet report, that's exactly what EPSS gave us for this example here. It's a WooCommerce vulnerability, but the same applies. And it just shows, okay, the timeline, the EPSS score from 0 to 100% in blue, and red is on the timeline when exploitation was actually detected in the intrusion detection systems. So you'll see that EPSS triggered went high before exploitation activity was actually detected for real. So that's a key point. So EPSS gave an early warning of exploitation before it was actually detected. So EPSS can be used as an early warning. Okay, so getting ahead of things that are likely to be exploited. So interestingly, what you see is the nuclei templates were added. So when vulnerabilities are weaponized, as in they show up in Metasploited nuclei, the probability of exploit goes up significantly versus just a proof of concept. So this is another very important capability, for organizations to get ahead of those things that are likely to be exploited. Okay, risk-based prioritization. So, given we have exploitation evidence, as in CISA KEV and EPSS, we can plug those values into CVSS. And when we do that, if we look on the left, we have the CVSS base score, which doesn't use that input data. And then if we plug those values in, we get the CVSS temporal metrics, which support the exploit code maturity as an input, as in we feed that data in. And what we see is that relative to the standard CVSS base score, some of the criticals drop to high, some of the highs drop to mediums, and so we end up with less criticals and highs, etc. Not significantly less, but less all the same. So that's a good thing if we're using CVSS. and using exploitation data. So that's all part of the CVSS standard, and we can use, as I said, CISA KEV or EPSS as inputs for that. Alternatively, we can use decision trees a la the folks that list the known exploited vulnerabilities, CISA. They also have an alternative prioritization scheme, SSVC, CVSS spelled backwards. And what's good about that is it's extensible and it focuses on exploitation. So the three parts of risk are exploitation. We talked about the automatable or exploitability and the technical impact. So by looking at the data sources, we can determine for exploitation, is that active exploitation? In other words, is it actively exploited or is it weaponized? Is it just a proof of concept, or is there no evidence of, or POCs of exploitation? And when we plug those parameters in, so the two on the right are just taking the CVSS parameters, not using the CVSS score, but using the raw data as provided by CVSS, organizing the exploitation node on this data. And here's what we get. So we have a decision tree. And decision tree is very simple visually to understand. Those three parameters are shown here: exploitation, automatable, and technical impact. And from those combinations, you get 12 possible outputs. And so, as an example here, if something was actively exploited, we'd be going down on the bottom node from exploitation. If it's high technical impact, or if it's automatable and high technical impact, we basically land on leaf 12. And so that can be used as a score. But really what you see relative to CVSS, using those exploitation data inputs, you end up with a much more granular set of things to fix. Okay? And when we are tasked with remediating or fixing things, we want to fix the most important things and the highest risk things first, and have granularity of knowing what that is, because ultimately we're constrained by our resources. So something like SSVC, using the same data, gives us that ability. Okay, so the roadmap. So the guide was released in March, but there's some things happening. So we want to augment that dynamic signal that I talked about earlier as an early warning, and trying to understand, well, if a CVSS score changes, how can we use that? So I reached out to two folks who had written blog articles independently on this, and I said, hey, this is cool. Why don't you contribute to the guide and tell us more about that? So that's happening. I didn't know these people, reached out and said, yeah, cool, we're doing it. So Christoph and Rudy are working on that, very smart folks, and that's happening now. The other one is because EPSS is a probability, we can aggregate scores. And so we're working on that. So these are things that are happening on our roadmap. Okay. Wow, wasn't that exciting? So we cover a lot, but ultimately what it comes down to is, we know what EPS is, what it gives us, and how to use it, and why we should use it. So the takeaways. Prioritizing vulnerabilities by exploitation does reduce cost and risk. We focus on the things that really need to be fixed based on our available resources. And we should refine our prioritization based on our data. That is really what it comes down to. And that's what exploitation gives us that the other aspects of risk, impact, and exploitability don't. That's the key thing. And EPSS is a key capability in the absence of a full list of here's all the exploited stuff you need to fix. Simple as that, folks. So there's a lot of code associated with the guide. Everything I showed was an extract from the guide. It was just easy to click through this rather than me fumble scrolling around the guide, which is online. It's all there and more, and the code to back this up. All the data and diagrams that we showed are all there. So special thanks to Jay for allowing me to lead the effort and, creating EPSS. All the folks that did across the industry, the thought leaders. Yahoo for cultivating such a rich environment for people like me to thrive, putting people first. And the B-Sides crew, Nadine, and all the crew that I've met and talked to. And you. B-Sides is the conference that I like to talk at. It's a good crowd, so thank you.